In a quiet lab hidden deep within an American city, experiments began that would challenge the very definition of free will. Welcome to Hidden Index, where the past reveals what the present chose to forget. The file is thin, its contents sparse, mostly financial records, invoices, and receipts. The most important documents, the ones detailing 20 years of clandestine research, were ordered destroyed in 1973 by the Central Intelligence Agency's own director, Richard Helms. He believed he was protecting the agency from a government-wide panic caused by a political scandal known as Watergate. What he was truly burying was a history of secrets, a program of human experimentation that reached into the darkest corners of science and psychology. The story begins in the shadow of the Korean War. On April 10, 1953, the newly appointed director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Alan Dulles, delivered a speech to a group of Princeton alumni. Publicly, he spoke of American values, of the ideological struggle against the Soviet Union. But privately, a different kind of war was being waged. Reports had surfaced of American prisoners of war in Korea confessing to crimes they hadn't committed, praising their captors, and denouncing their own country. The term brainwashing entered the American lexicon, and with it, a deep-seated fear. The Central Intelligence Agency was, in the words of one officer, literally terrified of Soviet advances in mind control. They believed the communists had discovered a drug or a technique that could erase a person's identity and replace it with a new one. 3 days after his speech, on April 13, 1953, Alan Dulles approved the beginning of a top-secret program. Its name was MK Ultra. The MK was a prefix used by the agency's Office of Technical Service, and Ultra was a designation for its most sensitive operations. The stated goal was to develop a truth serum for interrogating suspected spies. But the project's ambitions were far greater. It was a search for the keys to the human mind, a quest to see if a person's behavior could be controlled, their memories erased, and their will broken. The man chosen to lead this search was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was brilliant, driven, and deeply secretive. He was the Central Intelligence Agency's master chemist, the head of its chemical division. He would oversee a vast and sprawling network of experiments, many of them conducted without the knowledge or consent of the subjects. Under his direction, MK Ultra would grow to encompass 149 subprojects, branching out into more than 80 institutions. These were not shadowy, back-alley operations. They were carried out in universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies, often funded through front organizations that hid the Central Intelligence Agency's involvement. Some of the country's most prestigious researchers and institutions would, wittingly or unwittingly, become cogs in the machinery of MK Ultra. The primary tool in Gottlieb's arsenal was a drug called lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. Discovered in a Swiss laboratory in 1938, the drug was known for its powerful hallucinogenic properties. The Central Intelligence Agency became aware of its existence and saw its potential for mind control. They were so concerned that the Soviets would corner the market on the drug that in 1953, Gottlieb arranged for the agency to purchase the world's entire supply of LSD for $240,000. He then tasked the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly with replicating its formula, ensuring an endless supply for his experiments. With this supply, Gottlieb and his team began a series of tests on unwitting subjects. They administered LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and prostitutes, people who could not fight back, as one agency officer later put it. In one case, a mental patient in Kentucky was given LSD for 174 consecutive days. The goal was to study the drug's effects to see if it could break down a person's resistance, make them reveal their deepest secrets, or even wipe their mind clean to be reprogrammed. The experiments were not limited to the marginalized. The Central Intelligence Agency also administered LSD to its own employees, military personnel, doctors, and other government agents, often without their knowledge. In November of 1953, a group of scientists from the Central Intelligence Agency and the Army gathered for a retreat at a cabin in rural Maryland. After several days of meetings, Sidney Gottlieb decided to conduct an experiment. He dosed the drinks of several of his colleagues with LSD. One of the men was Frank Olson, a 43-year-old Army biochemist and biological warfare expert. Olson had been a key insider at the secretive biological warfare laboratories at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He was one of a handful of people who knew the true nature of the Central Intelligence Agency's darkest projects. But recently, he had begun to have doubts. He had told his wife he had made a terrible mistake and had expressed his desire to leave the agency. His reaction to the surprise dose of LSD was severe. In the days that followed, he became paranoid, anxious, and deeply depressed. 9 days after being drugged, on the morning of November 28, 1953, Frank Olson plunged to his death from the window of his 10th-floor hotel room in New York City. The official verdict was suicide. The Central Intelligence Agency's internal investigation concluded that Olson had been informed of the nature of the drug shortly after its ingestion. His family was told only that he fell or jumped. For more than 20 years, the true circumstances of his death remained a closely guarded secret. It was a secret that would only begin to unravel with the declassification of a handful of documents years later. Frank Olson's death was not an anomaly. It was a direct consequence of a program that operated with no oversight, a program that viewed human beings as little more than subjects for experimentation. MK Ultra's methods went far beyond LSD. The program explored a wide range of techniques to manipulate and control human behavior. Researchers experimented with hypnosis, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, isolation, and various forms of psychological and verbal abuse. One subproject, number 54, was the Navy's Perfect Concussion program, which aimed to use suboral frequency blasts to erase memory. The project was never carried out. Other techniques included the intravenous administration of a barbiturate and an amphetamine simultaneously, one to induce sleep and the other to jolt the subject into a confused, vulnerable state. In Montreal, at the Allen Memorial Institute, a respected psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron conducted some of the most ethically controversial experiments under the banner of MK Ultra's subproject 68. Cameron's work focused on psychic driving and depatterning. He subjected patients, many of whom had come to him for minor psychological issues, to high doses of electroshock therapy, sometimes at 30 to 40 times the normal power. He would then put them into drug-induced comas for weeks or months at a time, forcing them to listen to tape-recorded messages repeated endlessly. His goal was to break down their existing personalities and rebuild them from scratch. The results were devastating. Many of his patients suffered permanent brain damage, losing their memories and their ability to function. The reach of MK Ultra was extensive. Experiments were conducted at federal prisons like the one in Atlanta, where inmates, including the infamous mob boss Whitey Bulger, were given LSD in exchange for commuted sentences. Bulger would later write of the terror of those experiences, of horrible periods of living nightmares and guys turning to skeletons in front of me. Another operation, codenamed Midnight Climax, took place in safe houses in San Francisco and New York. There, prostitutes hired by the Central Intelligence Agency would lure men back to apartments that had been outfitted with one-way mirrors and recording equipment. The men would be drugged with LSD, and agents would watch from behind the glass, studying their behavior. The rationale for these experiments was always national security. The fear of falling behind the Soviets in a new, invisible kind of warfare drove the Central Intelligence Agency to push the boundaries of science and ethics. But as the years went on, it became clear that the quest for mind control was a fruitless one. In 1964, MK Ultra was officially wound down, though some of its subprojects continued for several more years. The program had failed to produce a reliable truth serum, a way to create a robot agent, or any of the other fantastical tools of mind control it had set out to find. What it had produced was a trail of broken lives and a legacy of ethical violations that would remain hidden from the public for years to come. The secrecy was paramount. The project's very existence was a violation of the laws and values the Central Intelligence Agency was meant to protect. The records were classified. Few outside the agency ever knew they existed. The story of how these secrets came to light is a story of chance, of journalistic courage, and of a nation forced to confront the actions of its own intelligence apparatus. The process began in 1973, when the Watergate scandal was eroding public trust in government. The new director of Central Intelligence, James Schlesinger, concerned about the agency's own potential skeletons, issued a directive to all senior officers. He ordered them to report on any current or past activities that might fall outside the agency's charter. The result was a 693-page internal report compiled by the agency's Inspector General. It was known informally as the Family Jewels. The document was a catalog of the Central Intelligence Agency's most sensitive and legally questionable operations. It detailed assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic spying on American citizens, and, buried within its pages, the first official acknowledgement of a program of human drug testing. But before the Family Jewels could be fully analyzed, and before Congress could be alerted, a critical event occurred. Richard Helms, the outgoing director who had commissioned MK Ultra 20 years earlier, made a decision. On his last day in office, he ordered all files related to the project destroyed. He would later testify that he did so because he felt it was his duty to protect the agency from embarrassment and to prevent the identities of the participating scientists and institutions from becoming public. The files were shredded, burned, and turned to pulp. The history of MK Ultra was, for all intents and purposes, erased. But history is not so easily erased. In December of 1974, the journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell story in the New York Times. His sources had told him about the Family Jewels, and his article exposed a massive, illegal domestic intelligence operation by the Central Intelligence Agency against the anti-war movement and other dissident groups within the United States of America. The public outcry was immediate and intense. In response to the growing scandal, the United States Senate formed a special committee to investigate abuses by the intelligence agencies. It was officially titled the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, but it would become known to the world by the name of its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The Church Committee began its investigation in 1975. When they started looking for records related to the mind control programs mentioned in the Family Jewels, they hit a wall of silence. The files, they were told, had been destroyed. The program was a ghost, but the committee's investigators were persistent. They began to follow the only trail that remained, the money. While Richard Helms had succeeded in destroying the operational files, he had overlooked the financial records. The agency's auditing department had stored its documents separately. And so, investigators began the painstaking process of piecing together a 20-year conspiracy from a collection of receipts, payment vouchers, and travel logs. It was through these dry financial documents that the vast scope of the program was slowly, shockingly, revealed. They found payments to front organizations like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which funneled millions of dollars to universities and hospitals. They found contracts with researchers, many of whom had no idea their work was being funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. They uncovered the records for Subproject 68, leading them to Dr. Cameron's experiments in Montreal. And they found the expense reports from the New York and San Francisco safe houses used for Operation Midnight Climax. It was also through this investigation that the family of Frank Olson finally learned the truth about his death. 22 years after he fell from that hotel window, the Church Committee uncovered a set of documents related to the incident that had survived the purge. The details were presented to the Olson family. The secret drugging, the subsequent paranoia, the Central Intelligence Agency's cover-up. The news was devastating. The family received a formal apology from President Gerald Ford and a financial settlement from the government. But for Frank Olson's sons, the story did not end there. They questioned the official narrative of suicide. Decades later, in 1994, they would have their father's body exhumed for a forensic examination. The new autopsy revealed evidence of a blow to the head sustained before the fall, leading a forensic pathologist to conclude that his death was a homicide disguised as a suicide. The case remained a dark, unresolved chapter in the history of MK Ultra. The revelations from the Church Committee painted a picture of an agency that had operated without meaningful oversight, driven by a Cold War paranoia that justified any means to achieve its ends. The search for a Manchurian candidate, an agent who could be programmed to kill, was not just the stuff of fiction. It was an explicit goal outlined in early agency documents. To achieve this, researchers explored a chilling array of techniques. They tested exotic botanical toxins and paralytic agents. They conducted research into creating induced amnesia. They studied whether hypnosis could be used to force a person to commit an act against their will, even an act of violence. The documents show that they considered testing these theories on inmates, with one proposal suggesting that an inmate could be hypnotically programmed to attack a high-ranking official. At the center of it all was Sidney Gottlieb. The man who approved these experiments was, by all accounts, an unusual figure. He had a doctorate in chemistry from the California Institute of Technology. He was born with a club foot and had a lifelong stutter. In his private life, he lived on a farm, raised goats, and was interested in folk dancing and a simplified, almost spiritual, existence. This was the same man who ran the Central Intelligence Agency's poison program, who developed lethal toxins for use in assassination attempts, and who oversaw 2 decades of non-consensual human experimentation. He saw no contradiction in his actions. He believed he was a patriot, serving his country in a war fought in the shadows. When called to testify before the church committee, he claimed memory loss regarding many of the specific details of MK-Ultra. He was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. He never faced legal consequences for his actions. The program itself was not an invention of the 1950s. It was the culmination of a line of research that began at the end of the Second World War. As American forces advanced into Germany, they discovered the extent of Nazi medical experimentation on prisoners in concentration camps. While publicly condemning these atrocities at the Nuremberg trials, American intelligence agencies were privately recruiting some of the very doctors and scientists involved. Under a program called Operation Paperclip, hundreds of German scientists were brought to the United States of America to work on projects deemed vital to national security. This created a moral compromise and acceptance that certain ethical lines could be crossed in the name of defeating a new enemy. This mindset gave birth to the predecessors of MK-Ultra, Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke. These earlier programs, initiated in the late 1940s and early 1950s, focused on perfecting interrogation techniques. They used a combination of hypnosis and drugs, including heroin and cocaine, on captured enemy agents and suspected double agents. They were the proving grounds for the much larger and more ambitious program that would follow. They established the principle that anything was permissible as long as it remained a secret. The public revelations of 1975 sent a shockwave through the United States of America. The idea that its own intelligence agency had been conducting mind control experiments on unwitting citizens was, for many, unthinkable. It sounded like the plot of a spy novel, not the sober reality of government policy. The church committee hearings, along with the findings of a presidential commission headed by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, laid bare the extent of the Central Intelligence Agency's abuses. For the first time, the American people were given a glimpse into the hidden history of their own government, a history of secrecy, paranoia, and a profound disregard for individual rights. This exposure was not a simple act of declassification. It was the result of a chain of events, a perfect storm of political scandal and journalistic persistence that broke open a secret kept for more than 2 decades. The unraveling began not with MK-Ultra itself, but with the broader political crisis of Watergate. The scandal created an atmosphere of intense scrutiny and distrust toward the executive branch and its intelligence agencies. In 1973, facing a government in turmoil, the new director of Central Intelligence, James Schlesinger, grew concerned about the agency's own hidden liabilities. He issued a memo to all senior staff, ordering them to compile a report on any and all past or present agency activities that might be considered illegal or outside of their official charter. The resulting document, a nearly 700-page compilation of internal secrets, was nicknamed the Family Jewels. It was a Pandora's box of clandestine operations, including assassination plots against foreign leaders like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba, illegal surveillance of American journalists and anti-war activists, and within its dense pages, the first official internal acknowledgement of a long-running program of non-consensual human drug testing. The report was a ticking time bomb. Before Schlesinger could act on its contents, he was replaced by William Colby. Colby, in turn, shared the report with members of Congress, but the true catalyst for public exposure came from outside the government. In December of 1974, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh of the New York Times published a front-page story that stunned the nation. Citing well-placed sources, Hirsch revealed a massive, illegal domestic spying operation by the Central Intelligence Agency, targeting thousands of American citizens during the height of the Vietnam War. While Hirsch's initial report focused on domestic surveillance, it shattered the agency's carefully constructed wall of secrecy and unleashed a torrent of public outrage. The political fallout was swift. In response to the escalating scandal, the United States Senate established the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. Chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, the Church Committee was given a broad mandate to investigate the full extent of abuses by the nation's intelligence agencies. As the committee's investigators began their work, they encountered rumors and vague references from the Family Jewels report about a mind control program. They began to ask for the files for the records of this project, codenamed MK-Ultra. But they were met with a consistent, frustrating answer. The files had been destroyed. It seemed the trail had gone cold before it had even begun. Richard Helms, the man who had overseen much of MK-Ultra and later served as the agency's director, had ordered the records purged in 1973, believing he was protecting the agency from just this kind of scrutiny. The order was carried out with chilling efficiency. Boxes of research notes, experimental data, and operational plans were shredded and incinerated. The history of the program, it seemed, had been turned to ash. But the cover-up was not perfect. In one of the great ironies of bureaucratic procedure, the order to destroy the files had not extended to the financial department. While the operational details were gone, the monetary trail remained. In a dusty government warehouse, investigators made a discovery that would change everything. 8,000 pages of financial records, detailing payment requests, travel vouchers, and contracts related to MK-Ultra. These were not explicit descriptions of experiments, but they were a roadmap. They contained the names of the researchers, the universities, the hospitals, and the pharmaceutical companies that had been involved. They led investigators to the front organizations, like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, that had been used to launder the Central Intelligence Agency's money. With these financial breadcrumbs, the Church Committee began the laborious process of reconstructing a 20-year conspiracy from its receipts. Each voucher told a piece of the story. Payments to a doctor in Montreal led them to the Allen Memorial Institute and the horrific experiments of Donald Ewan Cameron. Expense reports for apartments in San Francisco and New York, complete with purchases for liquor and recording equipment, exposed the existence of Operation Midnight Climax. Contracts with prisons and hospitals revealed the program's reliance on captive populations for its subjects. And among the documents, a set of files that had somehow escaped the purge detailed the agency's internal investigation into the death of one of its own scientists, a man named Frank Olson. For 22 years, the Olson family had lived with the official story that Frank, a brilliant army biochemist, had suffered a nervous breakdown and leaped to his death from a New York hotel window. The reality, as revealed by the newly discovered documents, was far more sinister. The files confirmed that just days before his death, Olson had been unwittingly dosed with LSD by his boss, Sidney Gottlieb, as part of an experiment. The government was forced to admit the truth. President Gerald Ford personally apologized to the Olson family, and they received a settlement of $750,000. But for his sons, Eric and Nils, the story still felt incomplete. They could not reconcile the man they knew with the official narrative of a sudden, inexplicable suicide. Decades later, driven by lingering doubts, they had their father's body exhumed. A second autopsy performed by a leading forensic pathologist revealed evidence of a significant hematoma on his forehead, an injury inconsistent with a fall. The pathologist concluded that the evidence pointed not to suicide, but to homicide. The man who knew too much, who had expressed a desire to leave the agency, may not have jumped but been thrown. The case remains officially unresolved, a dark emblem of the program's human cost. As the Church Committee's findings became public, more victims began to emerge. In Canada, survivors of Dr. Cameron's depatterning experiments came forward with harrowing accounts of their experiences. They were ordinary people who had sought help for everyday problems, anxiety, postpartum depression, even a stutter. Instead, they were subjected to massive doses of electroshock therapy, put into drug-induced comas for months on end, and forced to listen to looped audio recordings in an attempt to erase their personalities. The results were catastrophic and permanent. One survivor, Gail Kastner, had been admitted for a minor depressive episode. She emerged with the mind of a child, unable to remember her own family or how to perform basic tasks. For years, these survivors fought for recognition and justice. Finally, in 1992, the Canadian government acknowledged its own complicity in failing to supervise Cameron's work and compensated a group of his victims. The Central Intelligence Agency, which had funded the experiments, never admitted any responsibility. The men who ran the program largely escaped accountability. Richard Helms was convicted of misleading Congress, but it was for an unrelated matter, and his sentence was a suspended 2-year prison term and a $2,000 fine. He never faced charges for the destruction of the MK Ultra files, and Sidney Gottlieb, the master chemist at the heart of the program, was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. When he appeared before the committee, he was a diminished figure, claiming to have little memory of the specific details of the projects he had overseen for 2 decades. After his retirement, he pursued a life that was a stark contradiction to his past. He and his wife worked at a leper colony in India, and he volunteered at a hospice, caring for the dying. He dedicated himself to a life of service, as if seeking a private atonement for his public actions. He never publicly expressed regret for MK Ultra, maintaining that his work had been a necessary, if unpleasant, duty in the defense of his country. The legacy of MK Ultra is twofold. First, it led to genuine and lasting reforms. The public outrage from the Church Committee's revelations forced the government to establish new systems of oversight for the intelligence community. Executive orders were signed to prohibit non-consensual human experimentation and political assassinations. The era of the rogue agency operating with a blank check and no accountability was, at least officially, brought to an end. But the second legacy is more complex and insidious. The destruction of the records created a void, a permanent shadow of uncertainty. In the absence of complete facts, MK Ultra became a cornerstone of modern conspiracy culture. It was a confirmed case of a government's darkest paranoid fantasies becoming reality, which made any other theory, no matter how outlandish, seem plausible. The program has been linked with varying degrees of evidence to the assassinations of political figures, the creation of cult leaders, and the actions of lone gunmen. It blurred the line between historical fact and conspiratorial fiction, leaving behind a deep and enduring scar on public trust. But when the documents were finally declassified, the story they told was not of science, but of control. The search for a magic bullet to unlock the human mind had failed. It produced no truth serum, no sleeper agents, no reliable method for controlling human behavior. The only thing it had successfully managed to do was destroy lives, shatter families, and erode the very principles of the democracy it was meant to protect. It was a 20-year journey into the darkest corners of the human psyche, undertaken by men who, in their zeal to fight a perceived enemy, became architects of a nightmare of their own making. The project was shut down, but the question remains, how much of it ever truly ended? This was Hidden Index. Subscribe and uncover more stories the world was never meant to know.